it's appropriate that there are people calling in for this from around the world, because I think that the tools and processes we're talking about are really about how we collaborate across boundaries, and those could be boundaries of organization, those could be boundaries of public and private sector, civil society and government, different stakeholders in an enterprise. And as things move faster and faster in the world, the old ways of managing and governing things just aren't agile enough. So, I'm very familiar with the technology world, and there's been this whole shift of thinking away from planning great big things and trying to do them over a long period, only to find that at the end of the process it's not what you really needed. And there's this growth of the idea of agile. How can we do agile projects, agile programs? And I guess what we're going to be talking about is an example of agile government, agile governance, agile collaboration in complex and multi-stakeholder systems. I've called the presentation How Governments and CEOs Can Listen to Stakeholders and Deliver on Their Needs. And there's two parts to that. There's the listening part to that, and there's the doing part. And if you could see my body language, I'm seeing this as a cycle. There's a sweeping up of listening, and there's a sweeping down of doing. And I really do see this as a groundbreaking approach to values-based collaboration from Africa. I'm going to hold the values piece till the very end, but I'd like you to listen, if you're familiar with spiral dynamics and with the Barrett values model, then I'd invite you to listen with those models in mind and what values and what means are at play. What values are these people and organizations demonstrating in their work, and what spiral dynamic means are coming into play? And maybe we can have a conversation at the end about that. So my sources in preparing this presentation are a presentation to the board of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance in December 2012, an annual general meeting presentation of KEPSA, Kenya Private Sector Alliance, in April this year, and an extraordinary document, the KEPSA, the Kenya National Business Agenda, presented to the incoming president of Kenya earlier this year. So when the president stepped into office, before he'd even been inaugurated, the private sector had prepared a document with 76 key issues that they felt would move the country forward, and 203 recommendations spanning all of the ministries and responsibilities of government. So imagine you're coming in as a president and you've got the collective intelligence of a large part of your nation available to you for action. We'll talk more about that. I'm going to make some observations, or we're going to make some observations, I hope, about Barrett values model and spiral dynamics as it relates to this. And I'm also drawing on, of course, our consulting resources and the processes that we've implemented at KEPSA. And as Phil would know from a past life of ours, for the last, I guess, 15 years, my colleagues and I have been working and deploying large-scale performance management processes, and we became impassioned about the question of how to build values into management and governance systems. So that's really embedded in this presentation. I'm an engineer a long time ago. I'm fond of saying that democracy is this binary signal every 5 years. In the UK it's Labour Conservative, and then 5 years we wait, and then it's Conservative Labour. And yet you couldn't drive a car by just doing on-off. You have many more controls. It's much too complex a system. A nation is much too complex a system to control through a binary democratic signal every 5 years. We need new ways that the whole of society can speak to government. Consultation as it works in our country, as I look at what's happening in Kenya, I see it as so inefficient and so noisy. And I see what Kenya is doing as a great role model for the business, the big society, an amazing role model. So if I'm coming into office as a Prime Minister, how can I possibly make wise judgments as to the priorities for my first 100 days of office if I don't have some systematic means of listening? If I'm a CEO, how can I possibly make wise decisions if I can't have a systematic process for gleaning and for distilling the wisdom of my customers, my stakeholders, my employees into actionable requests and recommendations? So that's my summary of this. There's an old light wire that you might just get a telephone signal down, and this fibre that you might get the contents of the British Library down in a few minutes. So the point is, we're creating new ways of collaborating where stakeholders across boundaries can deliver ideas, knowledge, priorities, actionable items quickly and efficiently. So we're really talking about how to draw on, how to capture the wisdom of the collective. Africa has a deeply ingrained tradition of dialogue circles and round tables where people sit together and wise, actionable decisions result. We've been working a lot in the Middle East recently, and there's a similar tradition which is named the Shura, differently in different countries, but Shura. Or in Afghanistan where there's the name Jirga. And these are extraordinary processes because they not only make decisions, they make social capital, they create alignment, they create a field of coherence and understanding. So what I'm describing is a unique and powerful synthesis of dialogue and collective intelligence with rigorous accountability and structure. And I'm picking those words out because we're on a call about as a values alliance, and to take the Barrett model, synthesis and dialogue are way up there, and accountability is in the middle, and structure is there at level 3. So we're combining the structured, the grounded with the higher level values. This is all supported by Gaiasoft's cloud-based software platform, which I'll endeavor to show you how these quite spiritual collective intelligence ideas we've embedded into a very pragmatic software process that, for example, we can talk about with and implement with engineers and accountants, but the process delivers a level of coherence and alignment that might be unexpected. So you're using very structured spiral dynamics blue process, but the result is a coherence amongst people and an understanding and alignment. So traditionally, round tables, or hotlas, that's the South African term, shuras, that's the Middle Eastern term, jirgas, that's the Afghan term, build collective wisdom, alignment, coherence, and trust. I've picked out a few examples. On the left, the voice of the people's jirga for the silent minority to bring coherence to that nation. That happened earlier this year, this summer. And on the right is the meeting of the pre-inaugural Kenyan president with the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, where they presented their national business agenda. And underneath is a beautiful sculpture from Berlin Park, which is of the 3 blind people, each seeing different parts of the elephant. One sees the trunk, one sees the leg, and one sees the ear. And each of them thinks that the elephant is a different thing, but they're all one elephant. We each see Kenya differently, but there is only one Kenya. So KEPSA is an engine to translate policy recommendations into actions that deliver the desired impact. So that's a pragmatic description of it. Amazingly, KEPSA distills up from organizations employing 13 million people. That's a large proportion of the population of Kenya represented in this process, through 80,000 businesses. who then report into 80 business membership organizations, for example, the Manufacturers Association, the Tourists Association, the Telecoms Association. You get the idea. So each of these different business management organizations has their own process of gleaning requirements to move their sector forward. Those are brought together with the requirements of the 50 of the top corporations in Kenya. And all of that is pulled into 20 sectoral roundtables. So this typically relate to ministries, they relate to tourism, they relate to agriculture. And those sectoral roundtables, so each of those, if you like, has a high bandwidth communication pipe of issues coming into it saying, these are all the things we want in the tourist sector. And they meet directly with their counterparts in the Ministry of Tourism, and they have conversations about what can we move forward and how. And if there are issues that cross-cut sectors, or issues that can't be resolved at sectoral level, they get escalated to what was the Prime Minister's Roundtable and is now the President's Roundtable. And the example that I gave you is of the 76 issues and 203 recommendations in the National Business Agenda, published and printed, ready for the inauguration of the new President. So here's just a little bit about as was this Kenya Prime Minister's Roundtable, now the President's Roundtable. This was a PMRT, Prime Minister's Roundtable, when the head of the WTO was present. And we talk more about the process, so I won't read through this slide. But the point is, you have the permanent secretaries on one side of the table, and you have the representatives of each of the clusters or sectors on the other, and work through an agenda of action items, agreeing how they could be moved forward. So it's like plugging in these two high bandwidth cables into one another to create collaboration and communication for the development of the nation. Another way of showing that same picture is on the left-hand side, we have a cycle of sectors meet. Let me show you. Sectors meeting here, reporting progress, identifying issues, and bringing them up to through the Kenya Private Sector Alliance into the Prime Minister's Roundtable. The Prime Minister's Roundtable then assigns each action that's agreed to a ministry. The ministry takes action, it reports on progress, and that comes back into the process. So there's these two complementary yin and yang processes, the process of advocacy management, the process of listening, the process of understanding, the process of engaging, which delivers into a process of performance management, execution, delivery, delegation, management, governance, resulting in bills through Parliament, policy, new policies or new strategies of government. So I've talked about this idea of an issue. And when we started informally working with KEPSA, there were meeting agendas where you have a stack of stuff to be done, and each time you go through an item, you have some actions that go in the right-hand side of the margin and minutes. Now that's manageable for one board if you have a rigorous. Now imagine doing that across 20 sectors representing 80 business membership organizations and trying to filter the results. You really need technology. It's impossible to manage that without technology. And the second thing is, if we learn from good level 3, from good process management, what is an issue? Well, why does an issue exist? An issue exists because there's something that if it was resolved would get better, and the country would get better. The conditions, the enabling conditions for the economy would get better. So we work with them to identify a maturity model or a life cycle of an issue. So you'll see it there. Red, an issue is identified. Orange, a request is made to the government. Yellow, the government commits itself to deliver on that request. Green, implementation is demonstrably in progress. And blue, the issue is resolved by observation of conditions in the economy. Yes, it's better. What we wanted is now happening. We no longer need attention on that. We can now put our collective attention on making something else better in this economy. An example I'm going to pick up later so we know what might be an example of an issue. One of the big opportunities for Africa and for East Africa is trade within Africa. So trade in East Africa. You have all these non-tariff barriers, and I'll give you a very practical non-tariff barrier. Roadblocks on the Mombasa to Nairobi road, which is used for a huge amount of the trade that goes into East Africa. So those roadblocks slow down trade and increase the cost of trade. So that's the kind of issue that the private sector would be raising to the government, and we'll look at that later. Okay, so we take all of these advocacy issues and we put them into a database which is fronted by or visualized through a scorecard. So issues from all those 80 business membership organizations, all those 20 sectors go into a database. They're stored in a scorecard, and that scorecard allows different ministries or sectors to see their part of the elephant. Let me just say more about that. Remember we talked about the elephant? Down the left-hand side there are all of those sectors. Those, if you like, are different lenses. We call them lenses or programs within a larger portfolio. Each of those is a view onto the elephant. So again, dropping to very pragmatic language, we're talking about efficient, effective public-private collaboration, goals and priorities defined in a simple scorecard, actions tracked and managed, delivering, quote, the enabling business environment. As a summary, I did this summary for another purpose for the UK government. All of this information we want to summarize. If you're sitting on a board or as a permanent secretary and you're wondering, of all the things I could do, where do I focus? Let's make that extremely easy for the leader to filter down from the 203 recommendations to the 6 that relate to my ministry, and let's be able to see at a glance the status of that issue. So here's an example of the real-time visibility that we're aiming for with KEPSA. At the top left here, you see a scorecard spanning the issues across the 20 sectors. You look at one of those sectors and you say, well, this particular issue, roadblocks on the Mombasa Road, is a problem. Let's click through and see on that. What's the definition of that issue? Aha, explain to me what's going on there. So you click right through to, a few minutes ago this happened. So from a 30,000 foot view of a nation of tens of millions of people, honing down to these are the, I think in 2012 it was 67 core issues. These are the core issues. Here's an issue we want to pay attention to. Here's the status of the issue, and here's precisely what's happening right now. So that's the kind of visibility that KEPSA want to give to their members and to ministers. And so if a minister wants to know what's needed, they can never, ever be without the information they need. And by the way, look at what a roadblock looks like on the Mombasa Road. You cannot speed over that roadblock or you lose your tires. KEPSA deals in issues, advocacy issues by sector. And an issue will be a request for a policy change, a strategy change, or a bill through Parliament, typically. But it's whatever the private sector or the stakeholder group prioritizes as important. Now here we're looking a bit closer. What does the President's Advocacy Scorecard look like? Down the left-hand side here we have a set of issues. For each issue we have a time series: July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, and we could go on. And we can see the status is color-coded. So at a glance, you can see that roadblocks were a problem in July 2012, and then they got worse in October 2012, and then they got better. So we've got our eyes on it. The private sector and public sector have got their eyes on it, and it can be seen. You can see that special economic zones is actually an issue resolved since January 2013. So do you see that? Try to grasp or see that this gives us a panoramic view across all of these issues. It shows us all parts of the elephant with time, January, February, March, through to the present. So it gives us a real feel for how the transformation, the change management process that we are seeking is progressing. And down here, you see the definition of that maturity model. So those color-coded stages, we call a maturity model. Down the left here, you see these different images of agriculture, East African community, education, environment, ministerial stakeholder forum. Those are each what we'd call a sector, if you're thinking of this as a portfolio of programs, these are programs. If we're thinking about the elephant, each of these is a different perspective on the elephant, which is the transformation of the Kenyan economy or the Kenyan policy. I won't give you a live demo now, but basically if I click on any of these sector icons, just like on your iPhone, I will see that sector. So between the previous screen, I click on environment and I'll see the filter or the lens or the view of the elephant, the subset related to environment. If I click on a particular issue in trade, for example, I'll see this non-tariff barriers in the East African community roadblocks, and it explains what the definition of that issue. And then if I click on it again, it will give me a full executive summary briefing. This used to be endless phone calls. The minister's asking this, how do we find out about who's it, who knows it, which piece of paper, which document on the computer? Now it's all there in one place. So this is gleaned from an operational database, a complete summary of the status, including an action item that's been promised and is red, which means it's overdue. I'm hoping that I've landed with you this idea that there's a whole body of employees working for 80,000 businesses belonging to 80 business membership organizations and 50 corporates, which report into 20 sectoral roundtables, which filter up issues and requests for policy change, strategy, and bills through Parliament, either at presidential or ministerial level. And that all of the data for that, all of the change management reports, all of the status updates are in a database, and everything that's known can be seen in summary through one long scorecard or through filters by sector. So we've got this very simple, pragmatic view onto a national transformation process. That's what I tried to grasp there, but I didn't want to stay in technology. And I hope you can see, if you're an iPhone or an Android user, that's completely familiar. You scroll down that list on the side and you can see any sector. You touch any, if you're on an iPad, you touch any issue and you can drill into it and see more. So the core value statement, which turns out to be extraordinarily powerful, and it actually came from the Prime Minister's office. The way KEPSA was born was that after the end of the essentially one-party system in 2003, the new properly elected government was inundated with requests from every corner for, we want this, we want that. And they said, and I'm putting up my hands if you would see my body language, wait, you've got to give us some priorities. You've got to tell us what you really want. And so the Kenya Private Sector Alliance was born, and I remember receiving a document on that as it was being created, and it was to give a coherent, aligned and consistent voice and to build an enabling environment for business in Kenya. The economy was completely stalled, and until the very sad failed elections, broken elections of 2000 and the 2007-2008 election, the economy was just storming along, heading for 10% growth. It was extraordinary, and it crashed after the post-election violence in early 2008. We'll talk about that in a second. So the government's office, and I believe I know who came up with this, but he won't admit that it was him, said, we'll do this, but on one condition. We sit together in judgment of progress, not in judgment of one another. So no finger pointing, no making wrong, no it's your fault. We're sitting down in judgment of progress. And when I was asked by a youth leader, I advocated for a couple of years with that same person I just mentioned, who will remain nameless, that a youth round table would be a really great thing. And at some point, one of my, somebody I've mentored in the youth movement came to me and said, we've been asked to gather a youth round table with 500 youth from around the country. How should we organize it? And my suggestion to him was the one thing to do was to build an agenda that's very specific and actionable, broken down by ministry, and give the Prime Minister things he can say yes to, and so he will ask to do this again. And don't allow anybody to grandstand and say how awful the government is. Allow people to make requests that the government can say yes to. Shortly after that process, that young man, by the way, became the young man who did the consulting for KEPSA and trained them in the system that I've just shown you. And shortly after that, the then Prime Minister Raila Odinga had round tables around the country doing a similar process. So that's just such a powerful thing. The context of collaboration, the context of we're in this together, is a very powerful catch-all value statement. I'm down to my summary really now. So we're talking about effective listening, multi-channel listening for agile, dynamic and responsive leadership and management of complex multi-stakeholder systems. That could be how a country responds to climate change. That could be how a trade bloc aligns itself to be able to more effectively increase cross-border trade. That could be how a bloc like the EU manages all the complex conversations and requests and issues between those different nations, and so that many people in different roles and functions can manage different aspects of a complex, multidimensional relationship. And what I've seen in working with this kind of process with international organizations is if we can get all the cards on the table, if we can get all of the wires in the cable working independently and separately, we won't clog up the line with the noise of the things that are blocked. We can collaborate on the things that we can collaborate on and resolve offline the things we can't yet collaborate on. So as we've done this work more geopolitically, I'm deeply inspired by the possibility of nations building peace and collaboration between them. And from the very pragmatic experience of KEPSA, it's very clear that public and private sector, civil society and governments can collaborate on a whole different level. And what I would say is there's an undefined variable or an undefined measure, which is collaboration efficiency. And collaboration efficiency is an ideal. And when collaboration efficiency is ideal and a 100%, magically all elements, all stakeholders in a system come into alignment to perform their roles fully and perfectly, and so that the greatest shared interest is delivered. So that's an ideal. And what we're doing as we create processes like this, and the work that we've done with Centre for Human Emergence, particularly in Holland on mesh working, is we're seeking to build in the real world this possibly spiritual ideal of human collaboration on a large scale, of 100% collaboration efficiency. And we're getting closer and closer to that. So I do see that this kind of process, or something like it, is essential to resolving issues like climate change, like water availability, like conflict resolution within and between nations. And on that subject, returning to the 2007-8 elections, that was scary. Kenya looked over the cliff, 300,000 people were displaced, 1,000 plus people died. I wept when the election result was announced. It was tragic. And it allowed Kenyans to really look at what was important. And coming up to this last election earlier this year, KEPSA, with their extraordinary convening power, created an initiative called My Kenya, and they brought together sometime the story of how that last election violence was resolved would be a great UKVA story. It's incredible, but we don't have time for it. And my friend Mike Eldon could tell it with amazing clarity. But in this year's election, what KEPSA did was they gathered the religious leaders, the leaders from different religions, different civil society, from business, and they all got together and they agreed that the priority, the number one priority for the election was peace, that the transition from one parliament to the next would be peaceful. And they went out and preached that in the churches, spoke it in the temples. Everybody put the same message out. And the way I heard it told by the chair of KEPSA, former chair of KEPSA, Patrick O'Barth, was that about 2 months before the election, in a very polarized and unfortunately tribal political system, the politicians, the leading politicians, started to pick up on this same point, that really it's about a peaceful transition. And there was some real statesmanship during the transition this time. And Kenya had a peaceful transition. So this kind of alignment, national alignment process, can build the resilience in a nation to be prepared for that kind of issue. So we should be building resilient nations. One of the most exciting things we're working on now is how this works with geopolitical stability, how it works in the stabilization of fragile states. We're working as well as with civil society colleagues in Middle East and Arab Spring countries, providing them these tools, processes and ideas as ways of building coherence. So there's huge potential. My hope in sharing this with you, some of these tools may be useful in the work that you're doing, either in the corporate context or the government or intergovernmental context. So this is about collaboratively managing complex change processes, government to nation, enterprise to stakeholders, nation to nation, international organizations. The value statement of sitting together in judgment of progress, the structure of round tables, particularly a marriage of shuras, jirgas, lahotlas, whatever we call them, round tables with a more Western style, hierarchical spiral dynamics blues structure, and the combination of wise, consultative, all voices spoken, all voices heard process of round table or lahotla, that traditional wisdom circle combined with the rigor of a meeting agenda that captures action items, installs them in a database, delegates them accountably to somebody within a government or governance structure, and so that they can report back on them. And so you've got a cycle of continuous improvement. So my sharing with you is to say that I do truly believe that this is a game-changing tool for leaders and CEOs, mayors, prime ministers, presidents and secretaries general, enabling all the different stakeholders to see all the parts of the elephant, enable governments and leaders in the context of modern complex societies and nations to call upon the ancient wisdom practices that sustained societies for 1,000 years at least before Roman times. You know, they're really ancient. We have ancient capabilities as human beings to build coherence and collaboration. And we have new tools of structure and this extraordinary information technology. If we put those together, they're really what we can create. Instead of having these momentary flickers of human greatness and inspiration where we act from our highest values, we can create organizations, institutions, and nations that resonate with those same values. So that's my share with you. And in putting down this presentation, I've acknowledged my dear friend Mike Eldon in Kenya, who has been a collaborator in this journey. And, you know, I should probably acknowledge the wonderful woman leader of KEPSA, Carol Kariuki, the program managers at KEPSA, Patrick O'Barth, the former chair of KEPSA, the new chair, Vimal Shah, who's a great advocate for this process, calls it the new operating system for KEPSA, to KEPSA generally for suggesting that this process should be working across the East African community. So this is, although I've presented this, I could speak for a long time about the extraordinary leadership of individual people at different levels in creating what I've shared with you. So thank you very much, my friends. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to share with you and the opportunity of synthesizing the structural with the spiritual, which this has given me. So thank you.